Good evening. My name is Mason Hensley. On behalf of the Vanderbilt University Speakers Committee, I would like to welcome you tonight to hear Captain James Yee, graduate of West Point and former U.S. Army chaplain. Captain James Yee saw his notoriety develop when he was accused of espionage and for passing secrets to al-Qaeda from detainees held at Guantanamo Bay, where Yee ministered. Please join me in welcoming Captain James Yee.
Thank you very much. And just to clarify, I never passed any secrets to al-Qaeda or what like you were saying. But I was accused of that, and I'm going to go into that, and I'm going to explain a lot of my experiences. But really, just to begin, it's really a pleasure to be here today, just to have the opportunity to share with you my experiences, both as a military chaplain who's served the United States Army, as well as an American Muslim in a very dangerous post-9/11 era. Thanks to all of those who were really instrumental in bringing me here tonight to Tennessee. I actually once lived in Tennessee about 10 years ago in Jackson, and it's always great to come back to some of the cities that I've previously visited. But let me touch a little bit more about my own background, about myself. I'm a third-generation Chinese American, meaning it was my grandparents who came to the United States. My parents were born here. Both of my brothers and both my two older sisters, my two younger brothers, as well as myself, were all born here in the United States. Third generation Chinese American. I graduated West Point in 1990, the United States Military Academy, and I've served in now two of our nation's conflicts. First, in the aftermath of the first Gulf War as a Patriot missiles fire control officer, and then more recently when I served in Guantanamo for Operation Enduring Freedom. But not only am I myself a former military officer, former chaplain, and former soldier, but the military culture is now rather rooted in my family. My father, who I mentioned, was born here in the United States, served in the U.S. Army when he was drafted during World War II. I mentioned I'm a West Point graduate. Well, I have a younger brother who is also a West Point graduate. And I have another younger brother who also serves in the U.S. military today on active duty as a doctor. He's an Army doctor, and actually he's in Iraq at this particular point in time, serving our nation. So we have all the males in my family have served in the U.S. Armed Forces, and that's something we're all proud of with regard to each of our individual contributions towards this nation's security. But not only am I a third-generation Chinese American, a former military officer, but I'm also a Muslim convert. I converted to Islam back in 1991, shortly after I graduated West Point. And that's a very important part of my life experience because that ultimately sets up how I would then go and become a Muslim chaplain to serve in our military. And I wish tonight I had the time to go much more into detail about my journey to Islam and how I was inspired, for example, by the first trip that I made to Mecca and saw the vast diversity displayed in the holy city. But today I really want to focus on my experience as a military chaplain, a Muslim military chaplain, and my experience down in Guantanamo and what would happen to me after serving in Guantanamo. It was shortly after I graduated West Point when I converted to Islam, left active duty, and then would go and study Islam traditionally, learning a little bit of the Arabic language, and then coming back to the ranks of our U.S. military in January 2001 to serve as a chaplain. In January 2001, I came back into the military serving as an officer, serving as a Muslim chaplain. And I had actually at one time hoped that one day I would become the first Muslim chaplain to serve the ranks. But actually by the time I came back on active duty, there were already a few who were serving in the Army, one or two in the Air Force, and another one or two in the Navy. But in January 2001, when I did come back on active duty as a chaplain, I was the newest Muslim chaplain. That very same year, just 9 months later, we all know what happened on September 11th. The tragic attacks on the World Trade Center, the attack on the Pentagon, and United 93 flight, which would later crash in Pennsylvania. They all happened on September 11th. At that moment in time, I was a Muslim chaplain serving our ranks, and immediately following those attacks, I was someone who very publicly stated that those who carried out those attacks, whether they were Muslim or not Muslim, needed to be brought to justice because they had targeted innocent civilians. I was on record as someone who had said that. It wasn't long after those attacks, in that immediate post-9/11 aftermath, that I was approached by senior level leaders on the installation where I was posted, Fort Lewis, Washington, who asked me if I would begin holding lectures, briefings, training sessions about Islam and the Muslim culture for our troops, for our soldiers. And I speculated at first why I would do that. Why was I being asked to do that? And as I look back now, I think perhaps it was because senior level leaders in our military knew immediately following 9/11 that our troops were going to be deployed to Muslim lands, to Muslim nations, like Afghanistan, like Iraq, and when we look at where our military is deployed today, how many tens of thousands of troops are in the Muslim world. But I took up this task. I began holding these lectures, these briefing sessions, educating our troops about my religion, my faith, Islam. I answered the many questions that these soldiers had about Islam, and many of them had questions. Well, many Americans had questions about Islam following 9/11, but my audience were those who were serving the ranks. And many of them who attended these briefings and lectures came away with a better understanding of the religion. And perhaps many of those soldiers who attended my lectures would later be deployed to a Muslim country like Iraq or Afghanistan, or maybe both. Maybe some of those soldiers who attended my briefings were deployed to Iraq maybe once or twice, or now 3 times, possibly 4. Maybe some of those soldiers who actually attended my briefings and training sessions in which I educated them about Islam were deployed to one of those countries in conflict and never came home. But nevertheless, for my contribution, I began to receive praise and recognition, not only from those commanders on my installation, but also from higher levels, like in the Pentagon and the State Department, as I would soon become a point person handling media requests about Muslims in the military and Islam. And I would handle those requests. And it was written on one of my officer evaluation reports that I would represent the military with great distinction in that aspect, in that arena. And I believe it was that notoriety, that type of praise and recognition that would then get me handpicked, specially selected, to go down to Guantanamo and be assigned the task of being the chaplain to the prison camp in Guantanamo Bay. This was back in November of 2002 when I would go down to Guantanamo. But when I received those orders saying I was to go down to Guantanamo and be the Muslim chaplain for this prison operation, I again began to speculate. Why did I receive those orders? I thought maybe it was because our military, our Pentagon, our government, we wanted to say that, yes, we did have these hundreds of prisoners who were being held in Guantanamo. Each and every one of these prisoners a Muslim. We wanted to say, yes, we had these hundreds of Muslim prisoners down in Guantanamo, but we also had our U.S. Army Muslim chaplain in Guantanamo to serve them. That would be an indication that we as a nation were being very sensitive to the religious needs of these Muslim prisoners. It would be an indication to the world that we were perhaps treating these prisoners in a humane fashion. This was my speculation, that perhaps was the reason why I was sent to Guantanamo. And maybe that was the reason Or maybe it wasn't the reason. But when I got down to Guantanamo, I would learn that I held two definitive roles. The first was to be an advisor to the camp commander on religion, on how the religious observances of these Muslim prisoners affected this detention operation. My other role was to be a chaplain to all the Muslims down in Guantanamo. Not only these hundreds of prisoners, which numbered up almost 700, somewhere around 660 or so prisoners. I was a chaplain to these Muslim prisoners, but I was also a chaplain to the many Americans who were down in Guantanamo. Not prisoners, but American Muslims who were also serving this Joint Task Force prison operation. Imagine, you have a prison population of 660 that at that particular time in late 2002 represented about 40 different countries. How many languages do you think were spoken in Guantanamo? Many. Languages like Arabic or Farsi, Pashto, Urdu, Turkish. Other European languages as well spoken by the prisoners included French, German, and Russian. Who handled the linguistic needs of this military operation? Translators, American translators, most of whom were American Muslims. And these American Muslims were essentially my congregation, so to speak, down in Guantanamo. They were the personnel, those who were able to attend the weekly Friday Muslim prayer service that I conducted. But I was also a chaplain to the hundreds of Muslim prisoners down in Guantanamo. And in that role as a chaplain to the prisoners, I was granted by the command, authorized, unescorted access into the prison cell blocks. The prison cell blocks where prisoners in Guantanamo were being held at that time in what I would call open-air cell-like cages made of steel mesh in a facility known as Camp Delta. I was one of the very few individuals who was allowed to openly, freely interact and speak with the prisoners in Guantanamo. I was able to speak with them and I was able to listen to them. Perhaps most importantly, I was someone who was able to listen to them. Because we would say in the military that a good chaplain is a good listener. So that's how I would focus my efforts with these prisoners, by listening to them. And what would I hear from prisoners in Guantanamo? I would hear really about what they were being put through as prisoners in Guantanamo, how they were being treated, or should I say how they were being mistreated, abused, subjected to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Now, in Guantanamo Bay, there are two operations. There's a detention operation, which is run by military police and guards. They handle the everyday needs of the prisoners, like bringing the prisoners their meals, their change of clothes, escorting the prisoners to recreation or to the showers, those types of things. That's the detention operation. The other operation in Guantanamo is the intelligence gathering operation. The job of this intelligence gathering operation is to extract valuable information or intelligence from the prisoners if they might have any. Who was in this operation? Interrogators, both federal and military. Their job to interrogate the prisoners and get information from them if they might have any. I, as a chaplain, was assigned to the detention operation, far removed from the intelligence gathering operation. Why? Because it would be unethical for a chaplain of any denomination to work with interrogators to extract information from prisoners. So, of course, I was assigned to the detention operation to work alongside the guards, to help relieve much of that tension that existed between the prisoners and the guards, to help and assist in getting the detention side of the operation to run much more efficiently and smoothly. But in my role as a chaplain to the prisoners and listening to them and speaking with them, I was able to gain a thorough understanding of what was going on inside that intelligence gathering operation, even though I was far removed. I would hear the stories, the concerns, and the complaints from the prisoners. And what was most disturbing to me as a chaplain, someone whose role in the military is to defend religious freedom. That's what gives legitimacy to chaplains to serve in a government institution in a society that has separation of church and state. Our role as chaplains is to defend religious freedom for those who serve the military, for those who might be employed on a military installation, and for those who may even be imprisoned or incarcerated by our U.S. military. Our role as chaplains is to defend that First Amendment right to religious freedom. But what was disturbing most to me as a chaplain was learning how religion was being used as a weapon against these prisoners. A weapon. And because each and every one of these prisoners is a Muslim, it was the use of Islam against these prisoners to try and break them, whether in the course of detaining them or in the course of interrogating them. And how was that done? Let me give you a few examples. First, we heard back in 2005, first from Newsweek, a report that the Holy Quran was being desecrated down in Guantanamo. This Newsweek report, it reported that interrogators were taking the Holy Quran and flushing it down the toilet. This Newsweek report was something that led to mass riots around the Muslim world, in which some people were killed in these riots as governments tried to quell these protests. Newsweek later had to retract that Newsweek report because of some inaccuracies of its reporting. But as the Muslim chaplain who was assigned to Guantanamo during the time when abuses of the Quran was an issue, I can confirm that the Qurans were desecrated, abused, and disrespected in many different ways down in Guantanamo when I was there. Perhaps I can't confirm the details of that Newsweek report where an interrogator might have flushed the Quran down the toilet, but I can confirm that guards, for example, when they conducted their cell searches, often recklessly tossed the Qurans on the floor, ripped pages, cracked bindings, and this would happen in front of the prisoners who, when they saw this taking place, became furious, protested, banging on their steel beds and banging on their steel doors from within their own cells when they saw the Qurans being abused. Their protests became a little more extreme. They began hunger strikes. Some of them actually attempted suicide, tried to hang themselves in their cells in protest of how the Holy Qurans were being disrespected. These more extreme measures of protest occurred when it was learned that interrogators were taking the Qurans into the interrogation room and in front of the shackled prisoner would throw it on the floor, would stamp on it, would kick it across the floor. Subsequent investigations into abuses of the Quran by the military would reveal that the Qurans were sat on or even urinated on. This is what infuriated the prisoners, leading to utter chaos in the prison cell blocks. This was a problem for everyone, but this was a way in which religion was being used as a weapon. The Holy Quran is a book considered by Muslims all over the world to be the literal words of God. It's held in the highest respect and reverence by Muslims. If you go into a Muslim's home, you find the Quran put on the highest shelf. It's never placed in anywhere that's filthy or dirty, never brought into the restroom. A Muslim student will never take the Quran and place it under his or her chair. Why? Because then you would be sitting over the Quran, and that would be disrespectful to what's considered the words of God, the literal words of God. And even when you look at our sister Abrahamic faith, Judaism, you find a similar practice and respect for the words of God. For when you go into a Jewish synagogue, where do you find the scriptures? In the ark, at the front of the synagogue, under lock and key. And maybe it's even the rabbi or a scholar, scribe, who can be the only one to actually script the letters of the Scriptures. This is because of its reverence, out of respect for the words of God. In Islam, we have that similar tradition of respecting the words of God. But in Guantanamo, the personnel in Guantanamo recognized the respect that Muslims give to the Holy Book, and they used it, or attempted to use it, to be a pressure point to break the prisoners. What's another way in which religion was being used as a weapon? Well, I saw how personnel in Guantanamo would exploit a specific aspect of the Muslim culture. For when you go to a conservative Islamic society, you'll find that there is a separation between the sexes, between men and women, out of modesty for one another. It might be, for example, in a conservative Muslim society, disrespectful for a man to shake the hand of a woman because that would be disrespecting his wife, and vice versa. This aspect of the Muslim culture was exploited down in Guantanamo. How? By the female interrogators who were employed in that intelligence gathering operation. And I recall distinctly the commanding general, when he gave his interviews to the media, often would say that the women interrogators down in Guantanamo were an essential part of the intelligence gathering operation, as they had a very creative approach to gathering intelligence. And what was so creative about these women interrogator approaches? In an operation that was very competitive between the men and women to get information, in an operation that had an enormous amount of pressure coming right from the Secretary of Defense himself to get information from these alleged terrorists. Well, these women interrogators felt that they might have had an advantage over their male counterparts. And what was that advantage? Their sexuality. As many of them were very ready to conduct an interrogation of a Muslim male prisoner after she would strip off her clothes, standing naked in front of a Muslim male prisoner, thinking that would frustrate him because he comes from a conservative Muslim society. She might go further and inappropriately rub her own body, her sexual private parts or areas, on the shackled Muslim prisoner in his chair. Again, subsequent investigations into abuses in Guantanamo now indicate or suggest that women interrogators even went so far as grabbing the genitals of Muslim male prisoners in the course of interrogating them. From my viewpoint, when I heard about this, when it was also confirmed by some of the Muslim translators who came to me in confidence, indicating that they were disturbed that these things were taking place, we felt that this was degrading, not only to the Muslim prisoner, but we thought it was degrading to these women interrogators themselves. I myself felt it was degrading to women in general, all women, because what were they doing except presenting themselves simply as a sex object in front of a male prisoner? Not an appropriate way to look at any woman simply as a sex object in any society. These were some of the things that I would raise concerns about. One other way that I'll describe in which religion was being used as a weapon was how prisoners would describe for me a particular interrogation room. They would tell me that they would be taken to interrogation, shackled at the wrists, the waist, the ankles. That's how prisoners in Guantanamo are shackled. And they described for me that they were taken to a particular interrogation room and they were forced to sit in what was a large circle marked on the floor, a large circle on the ground on the floor of that interrogation room. And in the center of that circle was marked another symbol, and that was the symbol of Satan. The pentagram symbol that represents Satan was in the center of this circle. And the interrogator would take this Muslim prisoner who believes in one God, for that's the core belief of Islam, to simply believe in one God, a true monotheistic faith, and would attempt to force that prisoner to bow down and prostrate in the center of that satanic circle. Maybe when you've seen Muslims pray, we bow down and we prostrate, we put our forehead to the ground in honor of one God. they attempted to force these Muslim prisoners to bow down and prostrate in the form of the Islamic prayer in the center of this satanic circle, while they would scream at these prisoners that Satan is your God now, not Allah, not God, the Almighty, the creator of all things. So this was a way in which they took a person's faith, belief in God, and attempted to exploit that and attack these individual prisoners' personal integrity, violating their religious rights. This was what was most disturbing to me as a chaplain, because it dealt with religion and religious freedom, a fundamental value of our nation. For when you look at our Constitution, we find embodied in that First Amendment the free exercise of worship. When we look at our history and recognize those who first landed on Plymouth Rock, they came in search of religious freedom. The very, very, very first cause of those who came and settled in this country were looking for religious freedom. But now, today, in Guantanamo Bay, as a Muslim chaplain, I observed how things had turned. And it was now religion being used as a weapon to humiliate and denigrate the individuals being held in Guantanamo. This is something I thought went against our values as a nation and would raise concerns to the chain of command and question, are we doing the right thing by violating our own national values? I not only raised concerns about these things, but I was raised concerns about other things in Guantanamo, like the conditions and how the prisoners were held in these open-aired cell-like cages. I would raise conditions about the ages of some of these prisoners down in Guantanamo. Well, why would I raise concern about how old these prisoners might be? Well, I thought it was appropriate to raise concerns when I learned that there were prisoners who were as young as 12 to 14 years old being held in Guantanamo. 12 to 14-year-old prisoners were held in Guantanamo. And there was actually a term for them. They called them JECs, juvenile enemy combatants. That's what we call them, juvenile enemy combatants. So I would raise concerns about these. And my chain of command, who I reported to directly, a lieutenant colonel, a colonel, who oversaw parts of the detention side of the operation, actually valued my input. I helped them gain an understanding of the reasons why sometimes the prisoners became unruly, caused chaos, and became uncontrollable by their guards. I would receive praise and recognition from them. A stellar officer evaluation report. I also was recommended for official military awards, 2 of which I received in Guantanamo, signed by the commanding general, later recommended for a 3rd higher award. I would then be given something else which I thought was a reward for my contributions down in Guantanamo, and that was R&R. R&R in the military is known as rest and relaxation. A military soldier, if he or she is ever deployed for a lengthy period of time, like a year or so, they can get R&R, meaning they can actually go home, see their family, visit for a week, maybe 2, but then have to return back to their military deployment. And sometimes that's even back to the combat zone. Technically or supposedly refreshed, rejuvenated, now re-energized. Well, I got R&R after serving 10 months down in Guantanamo. So I got on a plane and was heading back to Washington State, see my family, but I never made it there. Because when the plane landed at Jacksonville Naval Air Station, which is the first stop where soldiers land when they come back into the country from Guantanamo, I was met by some other people, customs officials, immigration officials, and then they would search through my bags. They would search through my bags, and then they would make these spurious claims that I was carrying some suspicious documents. That's what they said. I was carrying some suspicious documents. And then all of a sudden there were intelligence officers, Army, counterintelligence, Navy, criminal investigators, and the FBI. And then they would say that I was carrying classified documents. after which they would then get an arrest warrant. I would be arrested in secret and then thrown in prison. I was thrown in prison, secretly arrested, never making it back to see my family in Washington State. The next thing you know it, I'm in a prison cell in Jacksonville. Spent a week there, after which they would then transfer me to a super maximum security prison in Charleston, South Carolina, a facility known as the Consolidated Naval Break. That's actually the facility where our government holds U.S. citizen enemy combatants. Names like Jose Padilla, Yasser Hamdi, people who have been categorized as U.S. citizen enemy combatants, were in that very same prison that I was brought to. Well, I was there. And when they transported me to this prison, I was subjected to something known as sensory deprivation. Sensory deprivation. What's that? That was when I was shackled like a prisoner in Guantanamo at the wrist, waist, and ankles. And then I was thrown in the back of this truck, and an armed guard next to me would take out of his bag and put on my eyes these goggles, blackened out goggles, so I couldn't see anything. And then he would take out these other devices and put them on my ears. Now I couldn't hear anything. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't hear anything. I'm shackled. I'm being subjected to something that's called sensory deprivation, a tactic which is done to instill fear and intimidation, confusion. But this was something that I knew about. How? Because down in Guantanamo, as I observed prisoners being brought to the base, to the camp, they were being subjected to this very same tactic of sensory deprivation. And I knew that our government's interpretation of the law was that these were enemy combatants and that they did not have rights. I feared at that time that my rights were being taken by my own government. Maybe all of my legal rights, maybe all of my human rights. I recognized that I was being treated like an enemy combatant, and that was fearful because I didn't know what was going to happen to me next. Well, prior to going down to Charleston, South Carolina, to the super maximum security prison, I had been approached by military attorneys, prosecutors from Guantanamo, who accused me of spying, espionage, and aiding the enemy. They even threatened me with the death penalty. And by the time I got to this prison in Charleston, South Carolina, the media reports were swirling with these accusations that I was a terrorist spy, that I had committed treason. All of this was in the news. But down in Charleston, South Carolina, it was something I knew nothing about because I was being held incommunicado, was not allowed contact with anyone, was not allowed to read a newspaper, had no idea what the media was saying about me. I was in that prison cell for 76 days as these accusations that I had committed these capital crimes were being reported. And they were actually listed on official military documents that I was to be charged with these offenses. But after days of being in that prison, what would happen next? I would be charged with lesser offenses, which they called mishandling classified information. I was suddenly released from the prison, but they tried to court-martial me. They tried to bring me to trial on these lesser offenses that I had, quote, mishandled classified information. By this time, I was at least able to retain a civilian attorney to provide me legal counsel, a military law expert from Washington, D.C., president of the Military Institute for the National Institute for Military Justice, Mr. Eugene Fidel, would represent me. I believe he's one of the foremost scholars of military law today. As he provided me counsel, one of the first things we did at a pretrial hearing was to demand from the military, to demand from the government that they turn over to us any evidence showing that I indeed had something that was classified. It could even be a report, a review of anything that they had seized from me to show that I had something that was classified. And the military attorneys at this pretrial hearing would say that they had never even initiated such a review. They didn't have anything to show that I was carrying something that was classified. So what happened next? That pretrial hearing was delayed. And then it was delayed again. And then it was delayed again, maybe 6 times in all, as the U.S. government carried out now an extensive search for some classified information so that they can hold me accountable for those lesser offenses that they had charged me with. But now it wasn't just a few papers that they were searching or looking through. It was literally thousands of papers, because they had now conducted federal raids on my residence in Washington State, on my residence from Guantanamo, on my office from Guantanamo, on the Muslim chapel from Fort Lewis, Washington, where I had served prior to going to Guantanamo. All of these places were raided by federal agents, and there was now literally thousands of papers they were sifting through to find some classified information to keep me in jail. But what would happen after months and months and months of investigation? Even those lesser charges would then disappear. They were dropped. My record was wiped clean. I was sent back to Fort Lewis in Washington State, reinstated as a Muslim chaplain to serve our service members in the U.S. military. It wasn't long before I would then tender my resignation from the U.S. Army, and I would leave. In January of 2005, being given an honorable discharge. And even when I left the military, separated, they also gave me a second U.S. Army Commendation Medal for, quote, exceptional meritorious service. I don't know. How do you figure that one out? But it's clear what happened to me. It was a gross miscarriage of justice. A gross miscarriage of justice. And some people sometimes ask me, they say, why do you think it happened to you? 3 reasons, in my view, at least 3 reasons. One is because I am a Muslim. I'm an American Muslim in a very, very dangerous post-9/11 era where I've seen the civil liberties of everyone in this country being eroded. But the American Muslim community has been under so much scrutiny since 9/11, as we are often characterized first as being potential terrorists rather than loyal U.S. citizens. You could even be a West Point graduate, a veteran of the first Gulf War, coming from a military family, 3rd-generation Chinese American. But that doesn't matter. If you're a Muslim, you're probably going to be suspected first of being a terrorist. And that's what happened to me. Maybe it was because some people in Guantanamo, when they saw me pray, bowing and prostrating in the form of the Islamic prayer, when they saw me read the Holy Quran in the classical Arabic language, they would recognize that this is how the prisoners prayed and read the Holy Quran. And if they're the enemy, well, then the chaplain must be the enemy too. And they would target me. But I also think this happened to me because of my ethnicity, being a Chinese American, being an Asian American. Through the course of this case, through the information that my lawyer was able to get, we learned of one of the first things that had been said of me. And that was, quote, who the hell does this Chinese Taliban think he is, telling us how to treat our prisoners? They called me a Chinese Taliban. Not just a Taliban, but they called me a Chinese Taliban. Someone was disturbed by my Chinese ethnicity. So my ethnicity also played a role. But no doubt, what I was doing in Guantanamo played a role in me being targeted. And what was I doing? I was advocating for our national values, like religious freedom, like humane treatment of prisoners, like diversity, religious freedom, justice. These are things that we as an American must all be advocating for. These are values that are reflected in our Constitution. I was advocating for American values, being patriotic, My patriotism was under fire. That disturbed some people. Why? Perhaps because I've been raising concerns about how prisoners in Guantanamo were being mistreated and abused, threatened some people. Maybe some of those intelligence officers who were engaged in abusing prisoners. They wanted me off that island. This is my experience over the last few years, serving as a military chaplain in Guantanamo and doing what is necessary that any American would do, that any officer would do. But I think my story, my experience, reflects something about where we are today as a nation. What has happened after 9/11? How much of our rights, our freedoms, have been taken away or have been eroded because of government response to those attacks on 9/11. I fear today that my emails are probably monitored, that my phone calls are under surveillance, that my mail, before I receive it, is open before I get it. I know my banking records from a front page article in the New York Times that even my banking records have been probed into by the military by something known as a national security letter. So I raise concerns about where we are as a nation. Where are our freedoms? Are they really being protected? And is there something that we can do as a people, as citizens, as students, future leaders of this country, can do to ensure that we as a nation protect the values that define who we are as a country and sets us apart from all other nations? It's my hope today that sharing with you my experience, that you might be inspired to really look at where we are as a country, to look at the freedoms that we do have, and that we do what we can to ensure that no one, especially our government, doesn't take them away. My name is Chaplain James Yee. I'm the former U.S. Army Muslim chaplain from Guantanamo. I think we have some time to open the floor to some questions and answers, but before I do so, I'd like to also show you some images so that you also have a visual of what Guantanamo Bay actually looks like. It's really been a pleasure sharing with you my experience. Thank you very much.
Mr. Yu will field some questions now.
Yeah, no, let me show
Oh, yours.
Yeah,
I'm
let me show
sorry.
some fun.
This
Yeah,
first.
we'll get to the questions. Let me just go through a couple slides first. And so you have an idea what Guantanamo actually looks like. Okay. This is the front gates of Guantanamo. This was actually where I was assigned, a place known as Camp Delta. Okay. This is how prisoners were actually transported to Guantanamo in the early stages. They were thrown in the back of these cargo planes, cargo strapped, with their arms behind their back, hooded. And when I actually saw this picture, I was not only disturbed by the actual treatment, but by something else. And that was what was hanging over their head. That's our American flag. And so when the world sees this picture, they say, this is America. Another look at how prisoners transported to Guantanamo. This is a picture of Camp X-Ray. Camp X-Ray was the very first prison facility opened in Guantanamo in January of 2002. The prison cells in Camp X-Ray were actually made of chain-link fences. And this was actually a photo that was released by the Pentagon to the world in an attempt to persuade the international community that we as a nation was actually treating these prisoners humanely. Okay. Again, Camp X-Ray. That's a closer look at the sensory deprivation. You can see the blackened out goggles, the devices on the ears, the ear muffs. I was subjected to this very same type of treatment, minus the mask on the mouth. I had the goggles, the ear things, and I was shackled. Top look at Camp X-Ray, a prisoner being escorted through Camp X-Ray. This is what Camp X-Ray looked like from the top. Now, when you look at this picture, does this look like a prison camp where you might hold human beings? In my view, it looks like a place where you might keep animals. And indeed, some of the prisoners would actually express that to me, that they felt as if they were being treated like animals. And then Camp Delta opened a couple months later. In Camp Delta, this prison cell blocks like this one had cells that were made of a much more sturdy steel mesh. There were about 19 of these cell blocks in Camp Delta. Each cell block held 48 cells, 24 on one side, 24 on the other, and a corridor that went down the middle. Let's go inside. That's what it looked like inside a Camp Delta prison cell block. You can see each one of those doors is a prison cell that a prisoner was held in. That's what the cell looked like. Well, that's, of course, what the cell looks like after the U.S. military mops it up, spick and spans the floor, waxes it so it shines, and then says, look how good the prisoners are treated. They have their own in-ground cultural toilet. They have a water fountain that they can drink from or wash before prayer. Wow, those prisoners have it good. The military would also say we give them these things, like a game of checkers or maybe a deck of cards, a couple extra packets of salt to make the food taste a little better. Actually, in Guantanamo, we referred to these items as comfort items. Comfort items. Why? Well, maybe they're supposed to make the stay of the prisoner in Guantanamo a little more comfortable. Sounds like they're at Hotel Guantanamo or something. But really, this is what they got. An empty cell, a flimsy plastic mattress, and if they cooperated, that's the word they used, if they cooperated with their interrogators or with the guards, maybe they got some of those comfort items. That's the steel mesh that I was talking to you about. What would it be like to look through this steel mesh every day of your life for going on 7 years now? Everything would just seem to be blurred, as you can see in this photo. Okay. Here you see a detainee being escorted. We were mandated, we were ordered to call them detainees, not prisoners. Why? Well, prisoner might mean prisoner of war. But guess what? Prisoners of war, under Geneva Conventions, have rights. But our U.S. government says, no, these are enemy combatants. They don't have rights, so don't call them prisoners. We call them detainees. And now if you look at every article regarding Guantanamo, they're called detainees. Camp Delta, this is actually the rec area behind each cell block. The routine was a prisoner had about 15 minutes in this rec area, followed by a 10-minute shower in something like this, 5 minutes to get back in his cell. Once every 4 days or so. That was the routine. Qurans that were allowed for each prisoner in his cell. I was actually able to implement this policy where they could take this little holder, and all it is a surgical mask from the medical facility, to hold the Quran high up in the cell because it became such a problem when the Qurans were being abused down in Guantanamo. The guard towers that surround the camp, some of them even have, again, our U.S. red, white, and blue flag. Okay. Security. This was known as Camp 4. Camp 4 was built during the time I was there. It was known as a medium facility in which prisoners can actually live together in rooms like this in groups of 10. Very, very few prisoners ever made it to Camp 4. But those who did, when I visited them in Camp 4, would actually say, this is just like solitary confinement, except that I have 9 of my friends here with me. As you can see, it's just a room with 10 beds. Camp 4. But Camp 4 was one of the advantages of being in Camp 4. It was the only place that did allow Muslims to pray together. A very significant part of Muslim daily prayer is to pray in congregation. This was the only place which allowed prisoners to pray together. And again, very few ever made it to Camp 4. Camp Iguana, this was the building in which those juvenile enemy combatants were held in, those 12 to 14-year-old prisoners. Camp Iguana. Camp Echo was supposed to be for the more high-value prisoners who never had to come out of his cell for any reason, not even for interrogation. As you can see to the right, there's an interrogation room adjacent to the cell, so that prisoner never had to come out of the cell for any reason. Much, much more isolated situation. Could not even see sunlight in the cell that you see here. This is Camp 5. Camp 5 did not exist back in 2003 when I was there. It exists now. As you can see, it's a very permanent prison facility, structured or modeled after a federal prison or a state prison here in the United States. Camp 5 today holds, I think, about 50 to 100 cells. Okay. Let's go inside Camp 5 and see what a cell looks like in Camp 5. It looks like this. Perhaps it's just a little bit claustrophobic. Okay. But now there's also a Camp 6, which houses about 200 cells. Again, a very permanent prison facility. From my understanding, most of the prisoners have now been moved from Camp Delta into Camp 5s and 6. And it's much, much more difficult to have any social interaction because in these cells, you're very, very isolated with concrete walls. There's no social interaction with other prisoners like there was in Camp Delta. This is an interrogation room, a simple chair with a D-ring on the ground in which prisoners were often what they called short shackled in a catcher-like position for hours as they were interrogated. Oh. Don't know. See if I can get back to these pictures. All right. Sometimes prisoners did need medical attention, and you can see if they're carted away, they would be brought to the detainee hospital. Okay? But the U.S. military often brags about the medical facility they have. They say, look, we got a brand new dental chair. We have cutting-edge medical technology, surgical equipment, and prisoners have even had surgical procedures done on them. And sometimes they even say that maybe these prisoners have better medical care than our own U.S. service members. In my view, I don't think so. Not when you have things like this. This is called a force-feeding chair. Why would you need a force-feeding chair? For those prisoners who go on hunger strike, their bodies, they deteriorate to maybe 70 pounds. The military says the mission in Guantanamo is to preserve life. So they won't allow a prisoner to die from a hunger strike. Instead, they get strapped into this chair so they can't resist. They take a tube, they lube it with petroleum jelly, and then they shove it down that prisoner's nose into his stomach, and they force-feed that prisoner with a liquid diet so he doesn't die. Okay. A chair like this was instrumental in stopping a hunger strike of 130 prisoners or so down to 4 within 2 days. Just because that process of having that tube forced into your nose and pulled out is so torturous, the prisoners chose to break their hunger strike. So with that, now I guess we can go to some questions, and I look forward also to your comments. But now you have an idea of what Guantanamo looks like. I think there are a couple of microphones on each side, so for anyone who might want a question, you just go up to the mic.
Hey, how you doing?
Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay. First off, thanks for coming. It was great to hear you speak. I have 2 questions, actually.
Go ahead.
First, you said when you were in South Carolina,
In Charleston.
you underwent sensory deprivation.
Right.
How often and for how long of periods of time did you undergo that?
That sensory deprivation was applied to me from the transport from Jacksonville down to Charleston, South Carolina. Not when I was in that cell in Charleston. It was done to me on the way down. Maybe they didn't want me to know where they were taking me or how they were bringing me down there. I'm sure it was on the interstate, you know. But I'll tell you, it was fearful knowing that I was being treated in this manner. Why? Because I recognized that this was treatment of enemy combatants who our government determined did not have any rights. So that's when I became concerned, feared that, man, they're thinking I'm an enemy combatant. I don't have any rights. I'm going to be in that same legal limbo that the prisoners in Guantanamo were in.
And my second question is, in the media, you hear a word associated with Guantanamo a lot that I haven't heard you use tonight. And do you...
Torture.
Torture, exactly. Yeah. Do you consider what goes on at Guantanamo to be torture?
I believe much of what goes on in Guantanamo is torture. Especially like waterboarding, for example. I believe one prisoner who the military suspected was suspected of being the 20th hijacker. There was one prisoner who was held when I was there, who the military tried to make the claim that he was the 20th hijacker. I believe he was. It's come out now that he was subjected to the waterboarding. That undoubtedly is torture. Some of the other psychological aspects. When religion was being used, I believe that's a type of psychological torture. But the indefinite detention, being held indefinitely, without trial, for years on end, in my view, would fall in what we might call torture. Though I'm not a legal expert or an expert in international law, but for those of you who really want to look into that more, go and find out how the legal experts define what torture is. That's an issue that I hope is going to be raised more in the coming weeks in the presidential debates. It's something that we haven't heard about much, or even Guantanamo, especially with the issue today being the economy. But I hope the candidates will focus more, especially in the first debate, which is supposed to focus on national security and foreign policy, that these issues of torture and Guantanamo come up.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Wyatt Smith. Thank you again for coming. Captivating remarks. I was wondering if you could speak to any reparations that you received following this ordeal, and how high in level of chain of command those might have come down from.
Reparations being like, what did I get?
Other than your meritorious service medal.
From the whole ordeal. Nothing really. I haven't even received an apology from anyone in any official position of leadership. I was just given my honorable discharge, and I was on my way. And that was it. I was asked earlier today if I considered bringing legal action to sue the U.S. government. But I found that being in the military, that there were legal obstacles that make it difficult for me to sue the Army. You know, legal doctrine like the Ferry's Doctrine, which essentially prohibits the U.S. Army from being sued by U.S. service members. So I found myself in a very difficult position to try and get some type of compensation. The only thing I really get now is a little bit of compensation from the VA, because I've been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder.
Thank you.
Hi. I think I remember reading in one of your interviews about prisoners after being exposed to, or not exposed, to sensory deprivation, that there's this phenomenon of what they call regression, I think, where they basically start acting like children.
Right, right.
I was just wondering if you could explain or elaborate on that.
Yeah, that's something I also wrote about. I observed with a particular group of prisoners who were held in a certain part of Camp Delta. It was known as Delta Block. And this became a pseudo-psychiatric ward. And in this particular cell block, I would see prisoners acting out in childlike behaviors. They would jump on their beds and they would play King of the Mountain. They would talk in some childlike babble. They were given crayons so they can draw pictures. It was a phenomenon. I didn't know what it was until some mental health professional would say, "Oh, it could happen when you are exposed to an extraordinary amount of stress. Your mentality regresses to that of a child, because when we think of children, they're often very oblivious to like real stresses, and because of their innocence and their the way they play games and whatnot. And so this is something that I observed in some of these adult prisoners, that they just acted like children, singing songs and stuff, and it was, in my view, because these were the prisoners who just could not take the type of conditions that they were being subjected to.
And I mean, it would seem that this would be counter to the goal, I guess you would say, of the interrogation to extract information is if they end up reverting to these childlike states.
Yeah, I would agree. But no, what's interesting is this particular psych block in Camp Delta had a team of psychiatric nurses and medical professionals, 17 of them. There was a team of 17 psychiatric nurses and mental health professionals assigned to this particular cell block. And 17, that's an indication that this was really a problem. It's also been said that perhaps maybe up to a third of the prisoners at one time or another have been on some type of antidepressants. I think they would use Prozac or what's known as an SSRI, a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, something that helps deal with depression down in Guantanamo.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Is this on? I have two questions. The first is, I'm under the understanding that like the U.S. prisons are much worse than the general public believes, and I just wanted to know how your Charleston prison experience differed from the really bad conditions in Guantanamo. Were the prisons like comparable in anything, or was it just really, you know?
Right. Now, when you say prisons in the U.S., you're talking about, when you say American prisons, are you talking about military prisons or prisons in general?
Prisons in general. I'm not really sure of the...
Yeah, you know, I would say prisons in general, there are issues about how prisoners are kept in the United States across the board. I mean, when we look at incidences like Abu Ghraib, where we saw the gross photos of sexual humiliation, you know, what was interesting to me is when I did some research and typed in Attica prison in New York, where you saw some of that same type of sexual humiliation where prisoners were stripped naked in a prison here in the United States. There was a prisoner, his name was Big Black, who they said was one of the ringleaders of the prisoners. And they would put him on a big four-stand table. The guards would put a football under his chin. He was naked. And they would say, if this football rolls off, we're going to cut off your testicles. Okay, this has happened in the prisons here in the United States. So when I saw something like Abu Ghraib, you know, it comes to no surprise that, you know, is this the same type of a pattern that occurred, you know, in Abu Ghraib with the humiliation? But yeah, in my view, our American public is not aware of how bad our military prisons are overseas. Guantanamo, Afghanistan, and the CIA black sites, which we know exist. But my experience in the military brig, in terms of the physical abuse, I was very fortunate. I didn't suffer any physical abuse by any of the guards, although I was threatened many times by some of the Marines that they were, you know, ready to pummel me when, you know, if I got out of line, and that they were hoping I would. But in terms of the psychological treatment that I got, you know, in my view, there were aspects of my detention that was worse than even in Guantanamo, like the withholding of my religious rights. You know, in Guantanamo, as a chaplain, I was able to preserve some of the religious rights for the prisoners, like ensuring that the Muslim call to prayer was done over a loudspeaker 5 times a day for the Muslim prisoners to pray during their proper times. I was able to ensure the meal schedules during Ramadan, the holy month of Ramadan, where Muslims fast from dawn until sunset, that the meal schedules were adjusted to accommodate the fasting during this holy month. I was able to ensure that the arrows, like maybe you saw in the pictures, the arrows pointing to Mecca, so that the prisoners knew which way to perform their prayers. But when I was put in a military prison, a U.S. citizen, I was denied some of those religious rights. The military chaplain who served that naval prison where I was held came to my cell and asked me if I needed anything. And I requested 2 things. One was the proper times so I could make my prayers correctly. I wasn't allowed to see a clock. They wouldn't let me have a watch. Didn't know what time it was. So I asked for the prayer times. And I even told that chaplain, you can get the Muslim prayer times by going to a website, like, for example, www.islamicfinder.org. You just punch in the zip code, and the 5 prayer times comes out, and you know when to make your prayers. Well, that chaplain said, no, I can't give you those. They won't allow me to give you the prayer times. They knew I was Muslim. The second thing I requested was the compass direction to the northeast so I can properly pray towards Mecca. Mecca to the northeast from North America. And again, they refused to even give me the proper compass direction. And so my religious rights were being refused as a U.S. citizen being held in military custody. And, you know, I often joke that, you know, maybe they didn't want to give me the compass direction to Mecca, which is to the northeast, because if they had done so, then, you know, I was a soldier, a trained U.S. Army soldier, and if they told me which way was northeast, then I, of course, could figure out which way was north, south, due east, due west, and if I was able, maybe, to escape from this super maximum security prison, then I might know which way to run, right? But the point is, as a U.S. citizen, I was denied rights that were even afforded to prisoners in Guantanamo.
Thank you. Also, my second question is that in Guantanamo, I'm sure you probably made friends with some of the guards who worked there or some of the other gentlemen who served. And I was wondering, what kind of people work there and are capable of like waterboarding? And did they, you know, was there like a consciousness of
from the everyday
violence?
guards? Yeah. How do you imagine that guards could actually engage in some of these practices or interrogators? I would say, though, for the most part, most of the abuses happened or took place in the interrogations and by interrogators, intelligence operatives. Some did occur with the guards, but to a lesser extent. But who were the guards? The guards, when I was down in Guantanamo, were very young people. Many of them never had even gone to college. They were young men and women who had joined the military, were trained as military police, never having any significant position of leadership or responsibility. And then now it is, they're in Guantanamo in complete control of another human being's life. They control when that person eats, what that person wears, when that person goes to the shower, when he gets to go to recreation. It was very easy for them to abuse this authority. And I think things really got bad when they started using religion to humiliate the prisoners. And the prisoners would fight back in any way they could. And how could you fight back in the cell except take a cup of water and throw it at the guards and get them wet or spit on them? And when that stuff started to happen, of course, the tensions grew and the guards would retaliate back. And of course, they had the means to retaliate in a much more violent manner.
This will be our last question.
Okay, we got one more question.
Oh, hi. I was wondering, in view of your experiences and your apparent disillusion with the U.S. government, I was wondering, who do you believe is the greatest nation on earth and why?
Again, rephrase that question about the disillusion.
Who do you believe is the greatest nation on earth and why, in view of your disillusionment with the U.S. government?
Okay. You mentioned disillusionment with the U.S. government. I don't have a disillusion with the government.
Okay.
Today, I'm disillusioned by the current leadership in our government. In terms of our government, the checks and balances, the executive, judicial, legislative branch, it's a good system. But you know what? Any system of government will fail if the leadership is corrupt. And I believe that we as a nation need a change in leadership. If we look at Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, the war in Iraq, the leadership that has led us through these things has failed us. And I believe we need a change. But without a doubt, the country that we live in right here is the best. Why? Because we have a constitution that gives us freedoms, religious freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of press. Supposed to have freedoms of illegal search and seizures. But since 9/11, a lot of those have been taken away from us. And these are the things which set us apart from other nations. So we have to be very wary not to let government or anyone else take away what is valuable to us. And that is our, and those are our freedoms.
Can I just, real quick? Wait, I'm sorry. I was wondering, I was wondering if you can blame the individuals for what happened at Guantanamo Bay, or who actually committed these acts, or the U.S. government. I mean, whose fault?
No, my blame
does
is
the fault
mostly
really
on
lie?
individuals. Lower level intelligence operatives who didn't like me, who targeted me, surely they're to blame. But it goes up the chain because command has responsibility. So I also hold Shirley responsible, the former commander of Guantanamo Bay, Major General Jeffrey Miller, who actually was recommended for a reprimand by U.S. Southern Command, which oversees Guantanamo. He actually scathed away without getting reprimanded. And if you go further, right up the chain of command to the commander-in-chief himself, if you follow the trail of paperwork of the torture policies, the legal memos, the executive orders that were signed by President Bush, it all goes back to him. So he has to also carry responsibility with regard to creating a situation where the gloves are off, where soldiers openly feel that they will not be held accountable if they violate international law. That's a problem. And so that's where I believe leadership has failed our soldiers and have failed our country.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming tonight, and I'd like to invite y'all to a book signing and a reception to follow. Thank you.
Thanks. How'd it go?
Good.
Okay, great.
Appreciate you coming. You're fine with the book signing?
Yeah, no problem.
Did you need your thumb drive, or is it?
Yeah, I think I have it. Yeah. Do I have it?